Hi, I'm Eric Vanman, an associate professor in psychology at the University of Queensland in Australia. One of my first scientific publications was this one, published in Personality and Social Psychology Review, entitled Connectionism, Parallel Constraint Satisfaction Processes, and Gestalt Psychology, Reintroducing Cognitive Dynamics to Social Psychology. You can see the lead author was Steve Reed, one of my mentors at the University of Southern California. I also happened to interview him last year for my 21 Questions with Academics, which you can find here. I'll talk a little bit more about this paper at the end of the video, but even if you don't understand what connectionism and parallel constraint satisfaction processes are, you'll see the word Gestalt there in the title. My main contribution to the paper was to review some of the history of early social psychology, which was heavily influenced by Gestalt psychology. The problem is that many social psychologists in 1997, and even today, still don't realize how important Gestalt thinking was to social psychology. I've made some other videos about Gestalt psychology that you can find at the end of this video, but today, in this video, I want to focus on how some key figures in early social psychology were very much influenced by Gestalt psychology. And we're going to start off with Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin, or you could also call him Kurt Lewin. He was actually called Kurt Lewin back in his home country in Germany, but when he moved to the United States, he told people to pronounce his name Lewin. Anyway, Kurt Lewin was born on September 9th, 1890 in the village of Mogelno in Prussia, which is now part of Poland. He was one of 4 children in a middle-class Jewish family. His father owned a general store and a farm. They moved to Berlin when he was aged 15, and he was enrolled in the gymnasium. In 1909, Kurt Lewin entered the University of Freiburg to study medicine. In April 1910, he transferred to the University of Berlin, where he was still a medical student. By the Easter semester of 1911, however, his interest had shifted towards philosophy, and by the summer of 1911, the majority of his courses were in psychology. While he was at the University of Berlin, Lewin ended up taking 14 courses with Professor Carl Stumpf. Now, after he finished his undergraduate degree, he intended then to do a doctorate in psychology and to do it at the University of Berlin, where he had developed his interest in the philosophy of science, and basically had also encountered Gestalt psychology because of Stumpf. Lewin hoped that Stumpf would be willing to direct his doctoral dissertation at Berlin. But, being the norms at the time, it would not do for Lewin to speak to this professor directly, in spite of the fact that he had had 14 courses with him. So what he did is he wrote up a dissertation proposal and he took it to the Herr Professor Doctor's office by an assistant. And then Lewin waited in another room until the assistant emerged and informed him that Stumpf had accepted his plan to investigate the relationship between associations, will, and attention. During the next 4 years, Lewin never once discussed his dissertation with Stumpf until the day of his final doctoral examination. His relationship to his mentor provides us a glimpse of how hierarchical this German academic culture was at that time, and it was a pattern that Lewin himself absolutely rejected as a role model. Anyway, at the outbreak of World War I, Kurt Lewin was just about to receive his Ph.D. In August of 1914, he was enlisted in a field artillery unit in the German army, but was able to return to Berlin to take his final exam for the doctoral degree the following month. He served with his unit both in France and later in Russia. In February 1918, while he was on active duty, he married a former student companion from the University of Berlin, Maria Landsberg. In August 1918, he was severely wounded, and he spent over 8 months in a hospital, recuperating before he was discharged from military service. An account that was written by Lewin shortly after that time tells how he tried to continue his scientific work as much as possible during the war, even while at the front. He managed to write up some research findings, published an article about the war landscape, and contributed a paper to a Festschrift for Professor Stumpf's 70th birthday. Well, in 1921, Kurt Lewin joined the Psychological Institute of the University of Berlin, where he was to lecture and offer seminars in both philosophy and psychology. Stumpf, who was the senior member of the psychology department, did a great deal to make that department in Berlin outstanding. He was a strong supporter of this new approach to the study of psychology and encouraged the Gestalt psychologists. Stumpf was largely responsible for eventually luring all 3 stars of Gestalt psychology, Max Wertheimer, Karl Kafka, and Wolfgang Köhler, to Berlin. And in 1921, Köhler became the head of the psychology department at Berlin when Stumpf had to retire. Lewin himself was starting to make a name for himself, both in terms of publishing and with regard to his teaching. He was an enthusiastic lecturer who attracted the interest of many students. His work became known in America, and he was invited to spend 6 months there as a visiting professor at Stanford University in 1930. With the political position worsening considerably in Germany, in 1933, he and his wife and his daughter settled in the U.S., and he became an American citizen there in 1940. Kurt Lewin was first to work at the Cornell School of Home Economics, and then in 1935 at the University of Iowa. This is also the year when his first collection of papers in English called A Dynamic Theory of Personality was published. The University of Iowa remained Kurt Lewin's base until 1944, and there he continued to develop his interest in social processes and to undertake research in that area. Significantly, he became involved in various applied research initiatives linked to the war effort from 1940 onwards, and these included exploring the morale of the fighting troops, psychological warfare, and reorienting food consumption away from foods in short supply. His social commitments were also still strong. He was much in demand as a speaker on minority and intergroup relations. He wanted to establish a center to research group dynamics, and in 1944, this dream was realized with the founding of the Research Center for Group Dynamics at MIT. At the same time, Kurt Lewin was also engaged in a project for the American Jewish Congress in New York, the Commission of Community Interrelations. It made use of his model of action research, which was research directed towards the solving of social problems, in a number of significant studies in religious and racial prejudice. It was also out of some of this work in 1946 with community leaders and group facilitators that he got this notion of what are called T groups. He and his associates were able to get funding from the Office of Naval Research to set up national training laboratories in 1947. However, all this work got to him. He was pretty much a workaholic by this point, and he died of a heart attack in Newtonville, Massachusetts on February 11th, 1947, before these laboratories were established. Even in a relatively short lifetime, though, he made many significant contributions, and I just wanted to review with you a few of some of the things that he did. And so these are just highlights, but you really could pretty much take a whole course just in Kurt Lewin to learn all about the different things that he did in his career. One of the things that he did is he advanced this thing called field theory, and it was very much informed by developments in physics, but also the way that the Gestalt psychologists talked about things. And you can see here he had a formula, and it was B equals a function of P and E, which basically means that he believed behavior is a function of the person and the environment. And so he's saying that if you really want to understand why someone does what they do, you have to take into account their personality characteristics, their motivations, their feelings, but you also have to take into consideration the environment in which that person is in. And so the way that he would try to understand it and make predictions was by talking about something called the life space and using topology, which again he borrowed from physics and its emphasis on forces. So in his idea, a life space is a psychological reality that's determined by both physical reality and the perception of that reality. And so you can draw it like this big oval, and the P there represents the person, and then the rest of that is the environment. Okay, and so a person's life space, everybody's going to have a different life space because we all have different person variables and we all have different environments. And so to try to understand and make predictions about behavior requires that we really understand that person's life space. You could take the person, for instance, and blow that up, and you could talk about the person in terms of all of these different sort of regions. And the regions you can see here are those big blobby things, and then there are boundaries, these dark lines. Regions are basically like your individual needs, like maybe your need for recognition, your need for hunger, your need for cognitive stimulation. And there are boundaries there. There are these walls that keep those regions separated. And each of the individual needs that's in a region has a certain amount of tension in it. And sometimes the tension builds up and builds up and builds up because you haven't got that need met. And it could actually spill through one of those boundaries and then create some more energy in another one of those regions. So the boundaries had different levels of permeability, how much the energy or tension could pass over to that. And then you can see that this is going to be especially true for what are called adjacencies, which are regions of the person that are very closely bounded by each other. So again, when some tension builds up, some of it's going to spill across to adjacent regions. And when you reach your goal, then the tension is going to be reduced for that particular region. And as I said, each region have different levels of tensions. There's no common pool of tension or drive like you might have talked about in Freud or even in Clark Hull and the way that Hull talked about this kind of stuff. It's all very fluid and not meant to be exactly measurable. And then the other thing would be the environment. And the environment has regions, barriers, and adjacencies. Here it's more like areas or paths one has to move through, and that sometimes there are bigger barriers in the environment to go from one region to the next. And so it's not meant to be like you can actually measure the distance between the region on the far left and the one on the far right. It's more like maybe the one on the far right is just harder for you to accomplish because you have to go through these other regions first. So you see, it's a very interesting way to think about personality, think about motivation, to think about social behavior. And then you could use this to make predictions again about the way a person's life space was arranged that can make predictions about their behaviors. Now, we'll come back to some of this in a little bit, but let me go ahead and tell you about another thing that he discovered or worked on. And it's related to these things with these tensions in these regions. Anyway, while he was working in Berlin, Lewin and his students used to spend a large amount of their time sitting in cafes and discussion. They noticed that one waiter in particular could memorize the order and not use a pad and recall all of the things that everybody had ordered up until the time the bill had to be paid. One day, though, they came back a few minutes after the bill had been paid, and they found that the waiter could no longer remember anything about their order. It was like he was finished with them, and boom, it's just gone from their memory. So according to Lewin, he said the explanation had to do with the fact that once you reach your object, your goal object, the tension is released. However, until you reach that goal, you'll be thinking about it, and there'll be like energy or attention associated with moving toward the goal object. So he had one of his students, one of the people who probably was sitting in the cafe there, named Bluma Zagarnik, do this for her Ph.D. thesis. And she conducted a study in which people had to solve a number of puzzles, like maybe between 16 and 20 puzzles. Some of these puzzles would be completed, and some of them were not. And then Zagarnik found that after the experiment was allegedly completed, and you asked the subjects about their puzzles, they could recall more of the incomplete puzzles than the completed ones. So it was like a 2-to-1 ratio. They could remember twice as many of the incompleted puzzles as the completed ones. Now, after 24 hours, this ratio got closer to a 1-to-1 ratio, but it was still better for the incomplete puzzles. And this had to do with this idea again that maybe a region in the person had a lot of activity or energy associated with it, and because the puzzles hadn't been completed yet, there was still a lot of tension there that hadn't been released. But once you reach the goal, you've completed the puzzle, the tension could disappear, and that's why you don't really have much left over to really recall about that particular puzzle as a goal. This led to other work that he did on what are called motivational conflicts. And so this is all stuff that you could derive from using that life space concept and the topology. But basically, he started talking about the fact that you could have two old goal objects in your life that are equally desirable. You know, you're really thinking about having this particular restaurant for dinner tonight, and there's this other restaurant that's just as appealing, and they're really, really equally desirable. So they're called approach conflicts, because you have an approach motivation to want to go to that restaurant. You have an approach motivation to go to that other restaurant. You can't go to both, so it creates a conflict. And somehow it's going to be resolved. And what he argued was that approach conflicts happen all the time in life, but they're not stable. They're short-lived. And the reason why is it doesn't take much for you to just tip to one side or the other. That, for instance, all someone maybe has to point out is that you're 5 minutes closer to the one restaurant than you are to the other one. And once you realize that now this one that's 5 minutes closer becomes more appealing, and so quickly the conflict disappears and you just approach that restaurant that's closer to you. So that's what he meant about them being not stable and short-lived. But other kinds of conflicts, like an avoidance conflict, this is where the goal is to avoid something. So you've got this really thing that you're trying to avoid, and you've got another thing over here you're trying to really avoid. Maybe it's that you really don't want to exercise, and you really don't want to take the time out of exercise to do your revising. So, you know, neither one of them is actually appealing to you, and they conflict with each other, because if you do one or the other, then the other one won't get done. So what happens is it becomes a stable situation there where you don't have to worry about resolving it, because neither one of them is going to cause you to be tipped towards one or the other, and you'll just end up avoiding everything because of that avoidance conflict. And another one that's interesting is an approach avoidance conflict, where basically the idea here is that there's something that you're going to approach, but it's in conflict with something that you're trying to avoid. And again, it turns out in those kind of cases, it's a pretty stable sort of motivational conflict. So they would do experiments with children, with adults, to look at these motivational conflicts, and found a lot of evidence in support of these ideas. And it all, again, derived from these ideas of a life space and the way the boundaries worked. Only giving you the shortest little introduction to them, I have to say that I think some of this stuff is just like the level of genius work. It's really clever. And I really recommend that if you ever have time that you go and try to find some of these books by Kurt Lewin. They're fairly approachable, and I think they're really quite interesting to read. I want to tell you one more contribution that he was focused on, and that was group dynamics. And this is really where you get the foundation of modern social psychology. Now, the other things I've been telling you about were more like cognitive personality, Gestalt psychology ideas. Perhaps because of his experiences in World War I, perhaps because all of his life he was always fighting for different kinds of injustice. He was very much a promoter of women in academia. He was really interested in macro group dynamics. Like, he was interested in what kind of government is the most effective kind of government to have for a society, and so on. While he was at the University of Iowa, he had this field station there, they called it, where he could actually have kids come in after school and participate in research projects. And so one of these he did was to look at how different leadership styles affect the productivity and enjoyment of the group. I wanted, though, to also show you how Gestalt psychology carried on, mainly through social psychology. So I have here Gestalt-flavored social psychologists. So just thought I'd go ahead and tell you a little bit about some of these other social psychologists who very much were influenced by Gestalt psychology. One of them was Fritz Heider. Fritz Heider did a lot of work on attitudes and on motivation. I think he ended up at the University of Kansas in the end, but originally he was a friend of Lewin's back in Germany, and he also worked with Kafka at Smith College for a while. So Fritz Heider became this very influential social psychologist in many different ways. And I'll just mention briefly that you can see how he was connected to Lewin and to Kafka, and that's why a lot of his social psychology had Gestalt flavor to it. Solomon Asch is another person. Now, you're probably more familiar with Asch because he's the person who is pictured here on this slide. He's the guy there on the left, and his experiment that he did was the one where you had these different lines, and you remember the subjects all see this X line, and then they're asked which one's closest to X, A, B, or C. And in one condition, almost everybody around the table says it's A, or they say it's C. They don't say it's B. And so then you want to see what the real participant, because all the rest of them are actually Confederates, you want to see what the real participant thinks and how they're influenced by that. And so you can see it's actually a study of forces. And that's how Solomon Asch thought about it. Now, Asch was born in Poland. His family immigrated to the US when he was 13. He received his Ph.D. from Columbia. And then he started working while he was at Columbia with Wertheimer, Max Wertheimer, because Wertheimer actually joined the faculty there. And then eventually he moved on to Swarthmore College, and that's where Wolfgang Kohler was. So Solomon Asch also took into account these kind of fields of forces and the ways that Gestalt psychologists talked about it, and using it to explain things like conformity. And then we have Leon Festinger, and I think he's probably the most famous of all the people I've mentioned today. Festinger is the guy who came up with cognitive dissonance theory, and he was a student of Lewin's back in 1941. He got his PhD there at the University of Iowa. Interesting side story was when I was an undergraduate at the University of Iowa, I was looking up, trying to find a book by Festinger in our psychology library at Iowa, and I ended up finding his PhD thesis. It was actually published and was like right there, the actual document, just on the shelves. It wasn't protected or put in some rare book room or anything. I just thought it was funny that I actually had held Festinger's PhD dissertation there that he had done with Lewin. He had come to work with Lewin because of Lewin's work on forces and conflicts. And by this point, though, Lewin had moved on more to that stuff about leadership. So Festinger was not really interested in that. But if you think about what Festinger later does, which is he does things like the theory of social comparison, and he does his work on cognitive dissonance theory, he's really talking about conflicts. He's talking about motivations and how they possibly are in conflict with one another and so on. So you can see how Festinger's social psychology is influenced by Lewin, who is in turn influenced by the Gestalt psychologist. So it just shows you again how influential this Gestalt psychology approach was, even if today you couldn't really find a Gestalt psychologist. I think that's the sad story here in the end, is that I don't think anywhere in the world that I'm aware of is there somebody who actually considers themselves to be a Gestalt psychologist. There are certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were influenced or trained by people who were trained by people who were Gestalt psychologists. And so their way of thinking about Gestalt psychology, or sorry, the way they think about psychology is influenced by these earlier intellectual traditions, which maybe a lot of people have forgotten about. I know, for instance, that my own advisor trained with a guy named Don Campbell. Don Campbell trained with Tolman, and you remember from a previous lecture that Tolman was the guy who did the latent learning experiments, and Tolman also spent some time with the Gestalt psychologist when he was in Germany. So I have sometimes noted to myself, I've seen some things that my advisor was interested in, and I think a lot of it might have been because of this sort of interest in type social psychology that was Gestalt oriented. Let me briefly talk about the 1997 article that we published on Gestalt principles in social psychology. I'm leaving you a link to the article down below, or you can send me a message and I'll be happy to email it to you. We wanted to show some new developments at the time in dynamic modeling that could be used to help understand basic social cognition. We wanted to introduce social psychologists to computing tools that they might use to model the kind of cognitive processes that Kurt Lewin, Solomon Asch, and other Gestalt-inspired psychologists could only talk about in their time on paper or chalkboards. Here's an example that appeared in our article where we showed how you could model person perception and how a person could decide, for example, that another person is generous or vindictive. I didn't do much of this modeling myself, but Steve Reed and Lynn Miller, the husband and wife team who were my co-authors, have greatly developed this line of thinking in the last 25 years. I suggest you look them up if you're interested in this kind of work. Well, that's all I have for this video. I hope you found it illuminating. Feel free to like and subscribe if you liked this content. And also, please leave a comment below if you're interested in this sort of historical psychology content. I always try to respond to my viewers' comments. Until next time, stay curious. Bye.